Today, I'm going to talk about the United States Constitution, the Second and Third Amendments. So, Second Amendment, I'll say more about than the Third Amendment, but anyway, Second and Third Amendments to the Constitution, which are part of the Bill of Rights. So the Second Amendment starts out saying, or it says in its entirety, it says, a well-regulated militia being necessary to the security of a free state, the right of the people to keep and bear arms shall not be infringed. So when I use brown text, I'm quoting directly from the document. So this consists of two phrases, and the arguments about its meaning often depend on which of the two phrases you're emphasizing. So you could emphasize the militia, arguing that this is more a right of the states, or you could emphasize the right of the people to keep and bear arms, that this is an individual right to bear firearms. So keep that in mind as we're going through here, that the arguments are often kind of an emphasis. Is it more the first phrase or the second phrase? So we'll look at the historical background. Back to very ancient times, an individual's right to bear arms has been advocated as far back as Aristotle, Plato, Cicero, and Machiavelli for self-defense and to keep tyrants at bay. So they saw this as not only personal self-defense, but also as a way to fight back against tyranny. In Saxon England, King Alfred gathered armed citizens together in 878 AD to defend against Danish invaders. So this was a militia, effectively, that he gathered of armed citizens. In 1181, Henry II of England issued the Assize of Arms, or Edict of Arms, which permitted free men to carry arms in self-defense. So we see, 900 years ago, that free men were permitted to carry arms in self-defense. So this is a very old right that has ancient roots back in Germanic and English history. And at times, during the rule of James II of England, he was Catholic and he disarmed Protestants because they were the disfavored class at that point. And later he lost the throne and William and Mary took over in the Glorious Revolution of 1688. They were Protestant and they disarmed the Catholics. So there's been some back and forth as to, sometimes a disfavored group might be disarmed. So it wasn't always everyone, all free men were able to carry arms in self-defense. But generally the rule was that free men, or most free men, were able to carry arms in self-defense. So this right has a long history within England, and then it also came over to America because many of the settlers were English, and we were an English colony, so we imported much of English law, especially English common law. And so various colonial laws also required people to be armed and to participate in the militia. So during the colonial period, especially late in the colonial period, the British government had a standing army and was quartering soldiers on people's private property. We'll talk more about this when we discuss the Third Amendment. The people distrusted a standing army, knowing that it could be used to oppress the people and trample their rights. So the British government had brought the army over largely to fight the French and Indian War, and they also kept the army here after that war was over. And so people were not so happy about that, because if you have an army standing around with nothing to do, they might start imposing the king's will on the people and trampling their liberties. So each town had its own militia, which was composed of the men of the town who were able to fight. And they would drill together and elect their own leaders. So it was a very, very local. It was the men of that particular town, and they would elect their leader. So the leadership was democratically elected among the people involved in that militia. So it wasn't a top-down appointment. It was democratically elected. That didn't necessarily mean that they elected the person with the most military experience. It might have been the most popular person. So maybe you didn't always get the best military leaders, but at least they were a leader that the men collectively had voted on. So presumably they would be willing to follow this leader because it was someone they had elected. So in New England, some of the militia were Minutemen who would be ready to, on a very short order, to fight as an alert went out. I don't know if they were literally ready in a minute, but they were ready very quickly with their gun and provisions to march and go where needed. So at the beginning of the Revolution, the British were occupying Boston, and they were trying to raid and confiscate arms and gunpowder that they learned were hidden around Concord, Massachusetts. So Concord is about 16 miles outside of Boston. So they marched out, and on the morning of April 19th, 1775, the news that the regulars were coming echoed throughout the countryside. This is the famous ride of Paul Revere, the midnight ride of Paul Revere, where he said, not the British are coming, but the regulars are coming, because they were all British citizens at the time. So they all considered themselves British. But the regular army was marching. So he said the regulars are coming. So the militia of each nearby town mustered and started marching towards Concord. So the Lexington and Concord militia, the Stowe and Sudbury militias, they all started mustering and coming towards Concord. And the British column encountered the Lexington militia on the town green, and it was led by Colonel Parker. And he said, if, stand your ground, don't shoot, but if they mean war, let it begin here. And a shot rang out. It's unclear which side fired it, but some shot rang out. And then the British troops lost discipline and started firing, and they killed 8 of the Lexington militia and chased the other militia off the green and continued their march towards Concord. So it wasn't an order given by the British, but the British soldiers just started firing when they heard a shot. As the militia gathered, they outnumbered the regulars at the North Bridge in Concord, and the colonial militia, advanced and killed some British officers. And so then the British finished their raid and started marching back towards Boston. And the militia were gathering strength because this message had gone out and out. And as the towns heard, they mustered their militia and marched towards Concord. So more and more militia were gathering throughout the day, and their strength was growing. And the British actually suffered pretty badly as they were fleeing back to Boston, and they had to send a relief force out so that the raiders wouldn't be annihilated as they ran back to Boston. So at the time of the American Revolution, we see that gun ownership was for self-defense, for hunting, and for serving in the militia. So in July 1775, the Second Continental Congress sent a declaration to the king about taking up arms. They were explaining why they were rebelling against the king. And they said, in our own native land, in defense of the freedom that is our birthright, and which we ever enjoyed till the late violation of it, for the protection of our property, acquired solely by the honest industry of our forefathers and ourselves, against violence actually offered, we have taken up arms. We shall lay them down when all hostilities shall cease on the part of the aggressors, and all danger of their being renewed be removed and not before. So they're saying we have the right to defend our freedom and our property. So the firearms we own, we're willing to use them to defend our freedoms and our property against violence that the king's troops had brought upon the people. And they say we're not going to lay down our arms. We're going to keep fighting until all danger of that aggression is ceased and gone. So they were asserting both the right to protect themselves and their property and to protect their freedoms. So during the Constitutional Convention, there was debate on about a standing army. So because of their history with the British keeping the army in America after the French and Indian War, so during a time of peace, they were very suspicious of a standing army. And as it turned out during the Revolutionary War, they could see that because the army was already there, it was used to oppress people. So they were debating whether they should have a standing army, which they distrusted, or many of them distrusted, versus a militia for self-defense. So they ended up giving Congress the power to regulate the militia and to raise and keep an army. So they were willing to allow an army to exist, even a standing army during peacetime. But the anti-federalists feared this would give the federal government too much power. So the Federalist Papers were written by James Madison and a couple others to promote the passage of the Constitution, the ratification of the Constitution. And James Madison, who was the author of much of the American Constitution, wrote in Federalist number 46, and he says, "Besides the advantage of being armed, which the Americans possess over the people of almost every other nation, the existence of subordinate governments to which the people are attached and by which the militia officers are appointed, forms a barrier against the enterprises of ambition more insurmountable than any which a simple government of any form can admit of. Notwithstanding the military establishments in the several kingdoms of Europe, which are carried as far as the public resources will bear, the governments are afraid to trust the people with arms, and it is not certain that with this aid alone they would not be able to shake off their yokes." Okay, so what's James saying here? So Madison's saying that the Americans are armed more than almost any other nation. Americans have the advantage of being armed. So he viewed it as a positive thing that Americans are armed more than every other nation. And not only are we armed, but also we have subordinate governments. As we heard in the previous talk, we have not only the federal government, we have the state and the local governments. And these militia were often local affairs. They were a town militia with elected officers. So they had military power at the local and state levels to fight back against any tyranny established by a federal or national government. So he's saying rather than a simple government, like only a national government over everything, we had these state and local governments that could push back against federal government trying to impose tyranny on the people. And also he's saying that in Europe, often they don't trust the people with arms. You know, you're only allowed to have arms if you're serving actively in the army. But otherwise they don't trust the people with arms. But he said it's an advantage that we're armed as a people. And I think that does indicate trust in the people. And typical of state constitutions at that time is this example from Vermont in 1777 that states that the people have a right to bear arms for the defense of themselves and of the state, and as standing armies in time of peace are dangerous to liberty, they ought not to be kept up. So there was a very definite bias against having a standing army in peacetime. They recognized that in wartime, yes, you need an army, but in peacetime, they thought it's better to disband an army so that you don't have it around to make trouble. So back to the text of the Second Amendment, a well-regulated militia being necessary to the security of a free state, the right of the people to keep and bear arms shall not be infringed. So from the historical context here, it's clear that both a militia, as opposed to a standing army, and the rights of individuals to bear arms were important when the Constitution was written. So we see that, you know, they thought a militia being necessary to the security of a free state. So they were worried that the federal government would have too much power. So their concern here is that a state be able to protect its own security. So the state versus the federal was kind of the goal of this first phrase. But the right of the people to keep and bear arms shall not be infringed. As Madison was stating, you know, an armed population indicates that you trust the people, and also that the people have power to prevent the state from becoming, the state or the federal government from becoming a tyranny. So both of these are important checks on the overreach of a government, particularly federal power. And the framers wanted to ensure that the federal government could not disarm the people, because that would indicate a distrust of the people, and therefore, you know, probably that the government was trying to infringe on the people's liberties. Gun control is often popular among leaders that want to take more power. For example, in Nazi Germany, Hitler disarmed the people, as a way that he could increase his power relative to the people. And the basic right here appears to be that the right of the people, to individual people, to possess and use firearms. So an armed citizenry allows for the possibility of assembling people into a militia. So if you have the basic right that people can own guns themselves for self-defense, then you can gather an armed citizenry together to form a militia. So there were, we'll talk a little about gun control laws. There were very few laws restricting gun ownership until the 20th century. Pretty much, if you wanted a gun, you went and bought one. And in 1927, Congress passed the Miller Act, which prohibited the mailing of concealable weapons. The National Firearms Act of 1934 regulated the manufacture, sale, and possession of fully automatic guns, commonly called machine guns. A fully automatic gun is one in which you pull the trigger, and if you hold it, pull it and keep it held, the gun will continue to fire bullets. Semi-automatic means one pull of the trigger, no matter how long you pull it, fires one bullet, and you have to let go and pull the trigger again to fire a second bullet. So that would be a semi-auto. But fully auto, a machine gun, if you pull the trigger and hold it, it continues to fire bullets. The Federal Firearms Act of 1938 required people selling guns to obtain a federal firearms license and maintain records of the names and addresses of those who buy guns from them. So here in the 30s, you're seeing that the start of maintaining lists of people who buy guns and starting to register guns. And in 1968, the Gun Control Act restricted the sale of guns. It prohibited the sale of guns to felons, the mentally ill, and illegal drug users. So they were starting to define classes of people that they didn't want to own guns. In 1976, the District of Columbia outlaws private ownership of handguns, pretty much entirely. And since then, there have been numerous other laws. We won't go into those details. But some court cases involved with this. Because there were very few gun laws until the 20s and 30s and later, there were very few court cases about these as well. If there's no law, you don't have a court case about it. So Dick Heller challenged the DC law banning handguns. And initially the district court threw out the case, but he appealed and the appellate court struck down the provisions of the law by a 2-to-1 vote. And in a landmark 2008 decision in District of Columbia versus Heller, the Supreme Court struck down the handgun ban by a 5-to-4 vote. For the first time, the court ruled that the Second Amendment did protect an individual's right to keep and bear arms by looking back at the historical context. So they looked at the meaning of these phrases and words at the time of the Constitution was ratified and what the situation was at that time. And they decided that, yes, this does protect an individual's right, not only the state's right to have a militia, but each individual's right to own a gun. In McDonald versus the City of Chicago in 2010, they struck down a similar state law and applied the Second Amendment to the states as well as the federal government under the 14th Amendment. So the Bill of Rights initially applies only to the federal government, but via the 14th Amendment, the Supreme Court has applied most of it also to the states as well. And in this case, they said the Second Amendment also applies to the states. We'll move on to the Third Amendment, which states, "No soldier shall, in time of peace, be quartered in any house without the consent of the owner, nor in time of war, but in a manner to be prescribed by law." So this issue was a major issue from the French and Indian War, which took place from 1754 to 1763, when the British needed to move troops around the American colonies. They were fighting against the French and their Indian allies on the frontiers. So the battles took place, in various places around the frontier of the colonies. And so the British needed to move troops around, and sometimes they would quarter them on people's private property. The Quartering Act of 1765, so this would have been just after this war ended. So Britain still has an army, standing army in America, and they made the colonial legislatures responsible for paying for and providing barracks or other accommodations for the British regulars, the regular army, as opposed to the militia, which when they're done, they go home. But the British regulars were still stationed in America. And these other accommodations, if it wasn't a barracks, it could be inns or livery stables or ale houses or other public houses. And a public house was basically a combination hotel, restaurant, bar, all combined into one building. So the colonial legislature could pay to put up the soldiers in public houses or livery stables or horse stables. But Americans saw that keeping a standing army in peacetime was too much of a threat to their liberty. There's too much chance for mischief and pressuring people to do things when you have an army standing around with nothing much to do. And they resented paying taxes to pay for the standing army as well. So this issue became most contentious under the Intolerable Acts in 1774, when the British quartered soldiers in private barns and uninhabited houses and outbuildings in Boston as part of their punishment for the Boston Tea Party, which had occurred the prior December, on December 16th, as well as they closed the port of Boston, which pretty much decimated the economy of Boston because it was largely based on shipping from the port. So the town of Boston wanted to keep soldiers farther away from the town center, while the British wanted them closer to the people in case some riot or something broke out. The people of Boston saw this as a threat to their freedom. In some places, the soldiers stayed in the military barracks away from the general population, which reduced the tension somewhat. And this Quartering Act of 1774, which was part of the Intolerable Acts, applied throughout the American colonies. So only the port of Boston was closed, but this Quartering Act of allowing British soldiers to stay on people's private property applied throughout the colonies. So pretty much that was unpopular across the colonies and helped unite the colonies, thinking that Britain was trampling on their rights. So the Third Amendment was placed in the Bill of Rights to prevent these abuses that had occurred under the British late in the colonial period. And it prohibited quartering soldiers without the owner's consent in peacetime, and it allowed it during time of war only according to a legally prescribed method. They left it open that Congress could write laws to say, okay, under these conditions, in wartime only, soldiers could be quartered on people's private property. But during peacetime, basically they said, no, only with the owner's consent. So, because when the British came along and said, you have a barn there, 5 soldiers need to stay there, you didn't have a chance to say, no thanks. It was required. So they didn't want that to be a forced thing. They wanted the owners to consent. So today the federal government constructs military bases for its personnel to live in. So quartering soldiers on people's private property is not really an issue. And there haven't been any substantial court cases dealing with this either. So today it's a very little, pretty much unused amendment. But it's important to understand the context as to why it was put there. So in conclusion, our right to keep and bear arms is pretty rare, even among Western democracies. Most countries have much more strict limits on gun ownership. And allowing individual citizens to have guns indicates a trust in the common people. And it's also a check of a threat of force against the government trampling our liberties. As we heard in the previous talk, the Declaration of Independence states that when governments become destructive to the means of liberty, of life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness, the people have the right to alter or abolish it. And so having an armed populace makes that threat a little more real. So it's a trust of the citizens and a check on government power. The Second Amendment also allows people to defend themselves and their property when the government cannot or fails to do so. As we see various cities starting to defund police forces, the government's basically not willing to protect people. So then people need the right to defend themselves if the government fails to fulfill that duty. And it also shows the distrust the founders had for standing armies. Because if you have an armed populace, you can gather a citizen militia, which helps counterbalance or lessen the need for standing armies. And the Third Amendment shows both respect for private property and that soldiers should not normally be kept in close proximity to people lest they become a menace to our liberty.
Because the flag still stands for freedom, and they can't take that